Today's scripture reading is taken from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 24 to 27. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. May God bless the reading, the hearing, and the doing of his word.
Good morning, church. We are starting a brand new series, and it is all about surveying and looking at ordinary people in the Bible and how they did extraordinary things. And today we're going to look at the story of Moses, but I think I need to kind of debunk something. There's this idea when you read the Bible that these people, these characters, these people in the Bible, they were already extraordinary people, that they are kind of like far above and transcendent and way better than any of us could ever be in all different categories. If you have ever read the Bible, you would know that all these people who God used are extremely ordinary people, just like you and I. They're extremely ordinary. They messed up. They did absolutely horrible things at times. However, the one thing they did that was great was they chose to follow God. They chose to listen to God. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at the story of Moses, and we're going to try and figure out 4 keys to effective living according to Moses' life. And this isn't necessarily 4 keys to effective living on how to, some type of self-help thing. This is not what it is. I'm talking about 4 keys to effective living within the Christian life, within the Christian world. So first we need to ask the question, what does it mean to live effectively? What does it mean to live effectively? To live effectively, I think, is when you have a stated objective or goal and you live in accordance to accomplish that stated objective or goal. That's what it means to live effectively. So if our goal as Christians is to be effective Christians, there are things that we must do to actually come about that goal of what it means to be a Christian, to be an effective Christian. I think we understand that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the story of Moses and how he lived an effective life, and hopefully we can glean some things from that. But first we need to figure out who is Moses, because maybe not everyone in the room knows who Moses is. So Moses is a pivotal character and figure in the Old Testament, and he's pivotal because in one time in history, the Israelite people, God's chosen people, were enslaved in Egypt to the Egyptians. And God chose Moses, who is living in Pharaoh's household, who is in a life of luxury. I think if we take the high end down a little bit in the EQ, that might help a little bit. He was a guy who was living a very luxurious life in Pharaoh's household, yet God called him to help deliver God's people out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land. And this story is pivotal, and this imagery comes about all throughout the entire Bible. So this is basically who Moses was. He was a pivotal figure in the story of Israel's history. So let's get into it. Let's learn a little bit about how Moses lived effectively and how we might be able to live effectively as well. So the first thing we learn is that Moses learned to be himself. Through looking at the book of Hebrews, which is a New Testament book, this is a New Testament author looking back on the life of Moses and telling us what he thinks. And Hebrews 11:24 says this: By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So if you know the story, you know that Pharaoh's actual mother sent him down a river because Moses' actual mother sent him down a river, and because Moses was going to be killed because Pharaoh had wanted all the firstborn male children to be killed. So she thought, well, sending him down the river is better than him dying. And at the end of the river, Pharaoh's daughter found Moses and adopted Moses. And he grew up in this life of luxury. And he probably would have identified with that life of luxury for a lot of his life. However, at one point in his life, there was a pivotal moment where he no longer saw himself as somebody under Pharaoh's household. He saw himself as someone who identified with the Israelites, as God's chosen people. If you were to ask Moses, "Who are you?" later on in his life, he would have said, "I am a part of God's family. I am a part of God's chosen people. I am an Israelite. I am no longer someone who identifies with Pharaoh's household anymore." And I don't think that's very different to you and I either. I don't think that's very different at all. Ephesians 2:19 says this, "Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household." What this passage is saying is that those who are in Christ, those who are followers of Jesus, are citizens with God's people, a part of his family, a part of his household, his chosen people. 1 Peter 2:9-10 says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." If you are somebody who has received the forgiveness of Jesus, who has received the mercy of God, you are God's chosen person. You are a citizen of heaven. This is who you are. So when we think of Moses' story and we can glean that Moses was himself, Moses, in being himself, was actually who God told him he was. And it's no different to you and I. You being yourself is not just what you create internally. It is what is given to you by God. You being yourself is who God has called you to be and who God says you are. So imagine this illustration for a second. Imagine a clock, like one of those nice fancy tall clocks. Imagine they were personified and they actually could talk just like Beauty and the Beast kind of thing. All right? And imagine you asked the clock, "Who do you think you are?" And the clock says, "Well, I think I'm a pilot." And you would just kind of scratch your head and you think, "Well, no, you're a clock." You wouldn't ask the clock who the clock is. You would ask the clockmaker who the clock is. Because the clockmaker made the clock and therefore had a purpose and an intention behind the clock. In the same way with you and I, we were created by God. And we can define who we are all we want. And yes, we have interests and different things that we enjoy, and we are in a relationship with many different people, and we are citizens of a country on the earth, sure. However, if you were to ask God, "Who are you, and what does it mean for you to be yourself?" he would say a whole lot of different things, I think, than the world would say about you. He would say that you are his child, you are loved, you are a citizen of heaven, even though you have a different passport on earth. He would say all those different things. So I think the very first thing that we need to understand from the story of Moses that we can apply to our lives is that we need to be ourselves. We need to be yourself. Be yourself who God says you are. This is the first thing I think Moses realizes in this very pivotal moment in the story. He realizes who he isn't, and he realizes who he is because of who God says he is. And I think this is where effective living actually begins to emerge when it comes to Christianity and following Jesus. The second thing, Moses learned to take responsibility for his life. Moses learned to take responsibility, to accept responsibility for his life. Hebrews 11:25, so the next verse over, says, "He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin." So Moses took responsibility in a moment of decision. There was a moment in his life where he chose to no longer identify with Pharaoh's household and to live in ease and in prosperity in that household, and he accepted responsibility for his life and chose to identify with his people, with God's chosen people, as an Israelite. And in doing that, he took responsibility and accepted responsibility for his life. He took ownership and actually made a decision, even though, in a sense, he was a victim of his circumstance. I'll get back to that point in a second. Mark 8:34 through 37 says this. This is Jesus. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" The key bit here is whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. What's interesting is the Bible continually talks about moments of decision. There's always a moment of decision in the Bible with different characters, different people in the Bible, where they were living in one way or they were associated with one thing, and then God calls them at a moment of decision to another thing. And what the difference between the previous life and the life that they're having is the moment of taking responsibility and choosing. Moses took responsibility and accepted that responsibility and chose, arguably, from a worldly perspective, a worse off life than living in Pharaoh's household, arguably speaking. And as Christians, we're called, through this metaphor of taking up our cross, is to, no matter what, follow after God's call in our life, regardless of the alternative, regardless of maybe the ease and comfort in life that we might be able to experience if we don't follow after God's call in our life. But I think taking responsibility is the opposite of having a victim mentality. This isn't to say that people aren't victims. Of course, there's victims in the world. That's why we have a whole justice system. It's because we understand that there are people who have had wrong done against them in some way. But the actual way to, I think, live effectively as a Christian is to, regardless of the wrongs that have been done against you or the passive way that life has kind of happened to you, is to accept responsibility. So I'll use Moses as an illustration again. Moses, arguably, was a victim in his circumstance. Yes, he was living probably a really wealthy and comfortable and easeful life in Pharaoh's palace, but he chose none of that. He chose none of it. He was a child who was floated down a river and then picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. And that was his life. He didn't actively choose that. It was passive. It was done to him. However, in that moment of comfort, through many years, he had to make a decision to take responsibility for his life and to reject being a victim of his comfortable circumstance, which you might think that's a weird phrase to say, but it's true. We can all be victims of our comfortable circumstance, and to accept responsibility and to choose a difficult life that God was calling him to. And I think in Western society, yes, not all of us are living an easy life. I'm not arguing that. But I think a lot of us might be living really easy lives. Not all of us have easy circumstances. We may be going through something really difficult right now. But I think the overall temptation when it comes to Christianity in the West in particular is being victims of comfort, of ease, and pursuing comfort and ease. Almost like those things are idols in our life. They can very easily trump and be higher than God's call in our life. And that's where the take up your cross and follow me is really important. It's really important because that's a moment of accepting responsibility for your life. It's a moment of rejecting being a victim of your circumstance, of the world that you've been brought up in, you've been socialized in, of the values that you weren't explicitly taught, but you were implicitly absorbed into through osmosis or whatever. It is through rejecting that actively and accepting responsibility through accepting God's call on your life. So I think that's the second thing we can learn from Moses' life is accept responsibility for your life. Accept responsibility for your life. The third thing, I'm not normally a bullet point sermon kind of guy, but the third thing that we can learn from Moses' life is Moses learned to establish his values. This one is so key. This is so important. I hope you're seeing the connection, how all these different things are kind of weaving together, that they're really essential. But Moses learned how to establish his values. Hebrews 11:26 says this, "He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward." Moses knew that experiencing hardship was better and more valuable than living in Pharaoh's palace. Moses knew what was valuable and established that value through accepting responsibility for his life. So he saw a value, he took responsibility through realizing that value and actually living into that value. And arguably, all of that comes out of who he knew he was, which was a child of God, an Israelite, someone who was chosen by God. And I think we can all apply that to our life as well. It kind of all flows together. Matthew 5:10 through 12 says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad." Rejoice and be glad. That one's a confronting one. "Because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." See, God and his kingdom and what God wants is more valuable than discomfort and suffering, is what this passage is saying. In a sense, Jesus is saying, you're blessed because of the discomfort and lack of ease and difficulty that you might be going through, because there's a greater reward waiting for you at the end of the day. This life is really like a blink. It's here and gone. But eternity with God and with him is eternal. It's forever. And that's the greater reward in the moment when you are going through difficult times. Romans 8:17 through 18 says, Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Who likes to listen to audiobooks because they have a long commute? Anyone? Podcasts? Yeah? No hands. You don't listen to things. What's going on? All right. I used to listen to a lot of podcasts, and I still do, but I realize that it's a lot better sometimes to listen to a book. I have a long commute out west to Henderson. I'm usually in the car about an hour and a half a day, 45, there and back. And I started listening to Christian autobiographies and biographies, just because I hadn't listened to that genre of book, and I just looked up all the best ones according to Google. And I came across this one by Richard Wurmbrand. He was a pastor in Romania during the 1950s and 60s. And if you know your history in Eastern Europe, you know that Romania was occupied by the Soviets for a long period of time. And he was a Christian in that context. And there were so many horrible stories that the Russian army and government had done against the Romanian Christians, the underground church in Romania. They were a persecuted people far above your wildest imaginations. I don't even want to begin to recount kind of the things that are recounted in this book. It's really will put a chill up your spine. But he tells one story in the book of very early on in the occupation of Romania, where two Soviet soldiers walked in to church on Sunday morning, just like this. They walked in with guns pointed, and they came right up to the front. And they looked at the congregation, just two of them, and they said, if you are willing to die for your faith, go to the left. And if you're willing to not die for your faith, go to the right. Can you imagine ever being put into that situation? This was a real story, and people were put into this situation in Romania. So as you would expect, there was a dividing in the congregation. A minority went to the left and said, yes, I'm willing to die for my faith. But a majority went to the right and said, you know what, I'd rather keep on living. So then the soldiers were up here at the front, and they said to the people over here, go home, leave, before we kill you. So they left, and then there was a small minority on the left, and I can't imagine what they were feeling at this moment, that, their entire life was kind of building up to this moment. They're probably having tons of anxiety. But also, they may have felt blessed in a sense, if what Jesus said in that passage is true. Blessed are those who are persecuted. But contrary to what everyone else thought in that moment, these two Russian soldiers put down their weapons, and they said, don't worry, brothers and sisters, we're Christians too. We just want to know who were the real Christians in the church. And I don't know what they would have felt in that moment. They probably would have felt a little bit, I don't know, not as distraught. But in that moment, the soldiers said, we wanted to do this because when the Soviets and the Russians, when we come in, when the army comes in, it is not going to be easy. It is going to be a serious persecution for the next who knows how long. And it was up until, the late 80s that the Russians were in Romania. And he said, this is now the underground church, and we needed to know who we could trust in the church. Because there was a situation where there was the established church that had compromised to communism, and there was the underground church that was then faithful to Christ. And these two were very different, and people were put into prison consistently for decades for their faith. But I would say that that group of Christians at that time, they had established their values. They knew what was valuable in life. They knew what was really important. They knew what really mattered. And they established those values. They took responsibility for their life because they knew who they were. They were a follower of Jesus, and following Jesus was more important than living. Because yes, the Soviets, they had the power of death on their side, but God had the power of life on his side. And in that moment, they chose life with Jesus over death by the Soviet hands. So that's the third thing we can learn. Establish your values. Establish your values. Here's the fourth thing and the final thing. Moses learned to keep his eyes on the prize. Moses learned to keep his eyes on the prize. I put eye. Now it's eyes, both eyes open. He learned to keep his eyes on the prize. See, once you know your values, you need to stay focused on it. There are so many distractions in life that can waver us and distract us to one side or the other in life. And if we have values that we truly value, we need to stay focused on those values. We need to stay focused on the prize. Hebrews 11:27 says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Moses, understatedly, had a lot of opposition. When he took responsibility and chose to follow after what God wanted him to do, he obviously had a lot of opposition. He had the entire empire of Egypt against him in that moment. And it would be very easy to compromise on his values against such opposition. However, he chose to keep his eyes fixed on him who is invisible, Jesus. 2 Corinthians 4:17 through 18 says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. We must fix our eyes on what is yet to come so that we remain faithful in the present. It is so easy to be swept up and to think that this is all there is. All you see is all there is. But to fix our eyes and to stay focused and to fix our eyes on Jesus means we're looking beyond just what we can see. We're looking on what we cannot see yet. Colossians 3:1 through 4 says, since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Keep our eyes on Jesus and what he has for us. Through reminding ourselves of the prize at the end, we can be people who live out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. 4 Sundays ago, I preached about Colossians 3:1 through 4 and how it's really important to set our minds on things above, not on things on the earth. This is exactly that. This is to stay focused means to actively pursue Jesus in every area of our life. And what my application was to write an identity statement that I read every morning. And I have still read that every morning, and I have found that incredibly helpful. There have been moments throughout the day where I would walk into a room, and because I had read this statement of basically Bible verses paraphrased into a statement, I was reminded of what my identity was and who I am. And as I walked into different rooms in different areas, I would remember that, and I would actually stay focused, and I would find that I would compromise less in my thinking and also compromise less in my actions. And it was purely through staying focused on Jesus and reminding myself consistently of who I am in Christ, and also the prize at the end, that yes, I'm living on earth now, but heaven's going to invade earth, and I'm going to be with God forever. And that is a beautiful thing. So that's the fourth thing that we can learn. Keep your eyes on the prize. So in summary, here's the four again, if you're taking notes and you missed one or two. Be yourself, who God says you are. Accept responsibility for your life through choosing the good rather than the easy. Establish your values. If you aim for nothing, you'll hit it every time. And keep your eyes on the prize. Stay focused on God. Now I'm going to reiterate what I said at the very beginning of the sermon, because you can easily get discouraged, because you're thinking, Joey, I'm not always who God says I am. Man, I don't always accept responsibility for my life. You know what? Sometimes I compromise my values. You know what? Sometimes I'm unfocused and I don't keep my eyes on the prize. And I don't think I'm living an effective Christian life. The reason why I think this sermon series will be encouraging to you is because of what I said at the very beginning. People in the Bible were ordinary people like you and I. They compromised on these things often. They did. But the one thing they chose to do was, despite their compromise, they chose to follow God. Despite their compromise, they chose to follow God, and they chose to move in that direction. So that's my encouragement to you this morning, is to continue to say yes to God, continue to pursue Him, continue to follow hard after Him, even if it's like a 3 steps forward, 1 step back kind of situation. Continually pursue Him. And if you were to ask me, Joey, how do you live an effective life? I think if I summarize everything there, it would be continually pursuing Jesus. That is what it means to live an effective life. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up, and we're going to go into a time of engaging prayer. This is a time where the worship team will sing in a song, and the front is always open, whether you have prayer needs within your family, of other people, that you just want to come to the front as an act of surrender, or if you want to come to the front and pray and just to say to God, I want to live effectively for you. Help me do that. I want to live effectively for you. Help me do that. So let's worship together.
Would you stand with us as we sing I Surrender?